Good evening. Welcome to the seventh in our lecture series. My name is Ruth Wilson. I am yet another member of the famous lecture committee of the Princeton Adult School. It's my great pleasure to introduce Miguel Centeno, Professor of Sociology and International Affairs and Director of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, and my former neighbor. Professor Centeno is a thoroughgoing Yalie. Should we hiss? He did both his graduate and undergraduate work there. He has a long list of publications, which I'm not going to reel off, many having to do with Latin America, but I will mention some projects that he is currently working on. One called The Triumphs and Dilemmas. One is The Triumphs and Dilemmas of Liberalism, another Visualizing Globalization, and an online historical atlas of globalization. Two other things I will mention among his numerous accomplishments and awards. In 1997, he was awarded the Presidential Teaching Prize, which is a very special honor. And in 2000, he founded the Princeton University Preparatory Program, which provides intensive supplemental work for lower income students from 3 local high schools. I think you should all know that the Princeton Adult School Lecture Committee is very indebted to Professor Centeno for his help in putting together this series. In fact, I think we should award him an honorary membership, except it's such hard work he probably won't want to do it. Anyway, we thank him, and I want you to welcome Professor Miguel Centeno.
Thank you, Woody. Okay, let me just test this. Is this okay, or do you need it a little bit louder? Okay, my voice, if anything, it gets louder, so, and faster. Welcome, good evening. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the Princeton Adult School for having me. As you will see, this is somewhat of a passion of mine, so I'm always delighted to bore or instruct as many people as possible in my little fascinations. I'm going to, because I get a little bit excited about this, I'm going to try to make this in 45 minutes. If you see me sort of hurrying like a madman towards the end, it's because I've got all this neat stuff to show you, and I'm rapidly running out of time. So I apologize if it gets a little rushed. So what I want to talk about today is mapping globalization. And you probably have all heard this term over and over again. If you do any kind of Google guide on globalization, you will literally come up with millions of pages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start first defining some terms, then show you some of the characteristics of globalization, then probe deeper and show you why mapping globalization might be the best way to approaching this. So first, what is this thing? What does globalization mean? And I always believe in the Oxford English Dictionary. So what does it say? Pertaining, one of the various definitions, pertaining to or embracing the totality of a number of items, categories, etc., comprehensive, all-inclusive, unified, total, pertaining to or involving the whole world, worldwide, universal. So globalization in some ways is everything. But as we will see, when things are everything, they also tend to be nothing. Let's give a few more examples of the kinds of things. And these lovely, I don't know if you make a habit of reading these. I do, I'm a true nerd. And they give you the first time certain words appear in context. And actually, these give you a good sense of what we mean by globalization. For example, Monsieur de Vogue loves travel. He goes to the east and to the west for colors and ideas. His interests are as wide as the universe. His ambition, to use a word of his own, is to be global. So global means to go around the world, gathering information, gathering aesthetics, gathering things, gathering flavors. We can see this 1943 one from the Air Force, Guides for Global War, a somewhat less optimistic view of globalization. Globalization is involving violence that can affect the entire globe and that links the entire globe. The last one, a little bit more technical, from a scientific journal, 1970, the meteorological global telecommunication system poses a second major problem. So the idea of a system connecting all the various parts of the globe. Okay, now when we talk about the globalization that you think, how much do we know about it? And you have lots of different visions of it. You've got this gentleman up here. Anybody know? Thomas Friedman, he of the mustache, who basically says that globalization is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Globalization is just wonderful. If you don't globalize, you have no hope. Globalization is really the only thing that's going to be able to save the planet. You have people like The Gap, who obviously love globalization. They see globalization as this wonderful opportunity to sell khakis to every single human being. And you've got folks like Davos, who see globalization as this great fruition of capitalism and modernity and development. On the other hand, you've got this gentleman with a mustache, Karl Marx, who has a somewhat darker view of globalization. He sees it, interestingly enough, as inevitable as does Tom Friedman, okay, but he does not see it necessarily as a positive step. You've got the protesters in Genoa or Seattle, choose your city, who believe, unlike the Davos folks, that globalization is evil, that globalization is bringing poverty. And you've got folks, for example, who believe that the kind of labor practices that are sponsored and supported by globalization are actually leading to exploitation, and they're against, in a sense, the gapization of the world. So we know all of this. But let's ask ourselves, how much do we really know? And there's a huge amount of information out there. If you do a simple electronic bibliographic search and you put in globalization in title or abstract, okay, what you find is you see a very clear rise up to 2001, some decline. A large part of this has to do with the Y2K, okay, but it remains very high. By 2006, we've counted something like 15,000 academic articles and trade journals about globalization. And what have all these taught us? Not very much. What we have is a lot of descriptions. We have a huge amount of numbers. But what the thing is, what is the social phenomena? What is the physiology, if you will, of globalization? What is the structure behind it? How do we understand it as a phenomena in and of itself? That we still don't know. And I want to show you a little bit why. First, globalization remains a black box. It's this thing out there. Something happens. We just lost $50 billion in hedge funds. It must be globalization. I found Toblerone, and you can buy now Toblerone in Singapore. That's globalization. It doesn't tell us anything. It's out there. We know it. And the best way I can always tell people about globalization, if they wonder, remember quaint 15, 20 years ago when you would go somewhere in a plane and people would ask you to bring back something? Now, anything you might want, you can get at McCaffrey's. You don't have to go anywhere. I mean, think of a product, okay, a legal one, in which you have to leave the state of New Jersey to be able to consume. Okay? It's there. But what makes that possible? What we have is a lot of theories. Globalization is this, and globalization is usually said with pretentious voices. I'm like, Neil, globalization is the increasing interdependence, blah, 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 blah. Increasingly, even worse, we have discussions about whether it's a good or a bad thing. Well, that's like asking if gravity is a good or a bad thing. If you're falling off a tree, gravity is a bad thing. If you wish to remain on Earth, it's a good thing. It sort of depends which side you're on. And to ask for a moral absolute of something like globalization is ridiculous. And yet so much of the discourse on globalization is precisely about, is it a good thing, is it a bad thing, is it good for us, is it bad for us, etc. Moreover, the empirical evidence is uneven. We've spent so much time discussing theories and discussing interpretations that we haven't really borne down at the level that we need to of empirical evidence. Consequently, we don't understand the structure of globalization. Now, in part, this is an academic interest, but it also has serious policy implications. Because if globalization is all around us, we better understand what it is. What are its unintended dynamics? Let me give you an example. An old professor of mine, Chick Perot, talks about something he calls normal accidents. Normal accidents occur when systems are so complicated that statistically it is a certainty that something will go wrong. You've got so many moving parts, one of those cogs is going to break down. And it is so complicated that it's very hard to locate where the problem may be. Globalization may be such a system, so complicated that something can go wrong, we'll never find out what it is in time, and it can lead to disastrous consequences, which is why it's so important that we understand its structure and what exactly it is. Which leads me to maps. What are maps? And I want to show you why maps in some ways might be the best way of understanding what globalization is about. So maps, again, borrowing from the Oxford English Dictionary, is a drawing or other representation of the Earth's surface or a part of it, made on a flat surface showing the distribution of physical or geographical features. So what we're talking about is a representation. A map is a representation. That is all. A map is a representation of a geographical space. Globalization is occurring in a particular geographical space, the Earth. So the first step, I would argue, in understanding it, is understanding what that map, what those routes are. What's a railroad like? What is the highway system like? What is the phone system like? Of that particular system as described in space. Now, there's just one thing about a map. It has to be an abridged form. It's a representation in abridged form. It is a summary. So a map allows us to take all these various aspects of globalization that we're going to find out and put them in there. Why abridged? My favorite quote from Jorge Luis Borges, who talks about the absurdity of a map that is not an abridgment. And that empire, the craft of cartography, attained such perfection that the map of a single province covered the space of an entire city, and the map of the empire itself an entire province. In the course of time, these extensive maps were found somehow wanting, and so the College of Cartographers evolved the map of the empire that was at the same scale as the empire and that coincided with it point to point. So we want to get this empirical evidence, but we have to abridge it. We have to summarize it in some ways so it can be comprehensible. So in and of itself, it is not so complex as globalization. We need to simplify it. And that's what mapping is all about. So what we're doing in this project is mapping globalization. It is empirically driven. We're anti-theoretical. Somebody starts talking about theory, we shoot them. We want data. We want data. And what we want to do is we're going to post this, we're posting this data all on the web for public access. Because the days when somebody could understand globalization, a single individual, are long gone. We have these 19th century images of the great naturalists walking around going, I get it. We're not. Globalization is going to require very much of a natural science model of each person contributing a little bit to a mosaic. We have a way to do that, which is the World Wide Web. So what we want to do is we're gathering this data, we're gathering these representations, and we're putting them on the web for public access. How? Data access on contemporary globalization. So all this data, you can go in and find out how many kumquats, country X to country Y. And we have a map collection of about 7,000 maps that show historical representations of globalization, which are in the process of being cataloged. Who is this? It's the Princeton University, University of Washington in Seattle, and the University of Technology in Sydney, who is responsible for what generates these interesting things, which I'll explain in a minute. These are the websites, and actually the easiest way to do it, if you want to look at the website, just go to the Princeton website and you Google MG, or Mapping Globalization, and it will take you to the main site. There's a couple of sites, but it will take you to the main one. We're not beta, we're sort of at a delta or a gamma stage right now. We should have it full on by the end of the year, but you'll get a sense of what we're doing. Now, before I start showing what we're actually doing, let me make an important distinction about globalization. It is important to distinguish globalization that's occurring inside countries and the effect that is occurring inside countries, whether your wages are going up, if you happen to be a computer programmer, or if your wages are going down if you happen to be a steel worker or a truck driver, or any version thereof. That is the distinction that's within country globalization, as opposed to between country globalization, which is how all these connections are established. For example, one of the big debates is between and within country inequality. One thing is to say that poor countries are getting poorer compared to the rich countries. Another thing is to say that the rich in rich countries, or the rich in poor countries, are getting richer than the poor in those same countries. Distinguish those two things. Largely tonight, what I'm going to be talking about is between country, okay? So there's a whole other aspect of the study of globalization which looks at what the implications are for the population inside these countries. But we're going to be taking a sort of a satellite view and looking only at the connections between them. I just want to remind you that there's another side of the picture, as it were. So let's ask a couple of other questions. How new is this? Is this something that was just invented in 1980, okay? Or is this something that's relatively old? Well, it's not very new. If you look here, here's a map representation of the population of the Earth. The human race globalized from the very, very beginning. If you think of globalization as something occurring as a transfer of populations, for example, across the globe, this already occurs from 100,000 to 20,000 years ago. So globalization in and of itself, in the sense of combining or linking parts of the world, is not new. Empires are certainly not new. Okay, here's a map of the Mongol Empire. If you want to see a great empire in terms of size, in terms of complexity, in terms of commercial relations, there's the Mongol Empire. So global diseases are not new. We have the Black Death, for example, which literally spreads from India throughout Western Europe with fascinating pockets of non-disease. Okay, and we can think of that as an early example of globalization. Germs, in a sense, or viruses migrating throughout the earth and connecting us in our illnesses. Global migrations are not new. For example, we have the massive Atlantic involuntary migration of slavery in the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and parts of the 19th century. Massive Europeanization of the world, okay, which occurs in the 19th century. I find it, for example, somewhat ironic to find Western Europeans complaining about other people coming to Europe to live there, when during the 19th century, 50 million Europeans were able to populate not just great parts of the planet, but if you think about it, they're really pretty parts. Australia, South Africa, the United States, Canada. So those issues are not new. They have been occurring. That globalization has been going on for many, many, many years. We have been connected for many years. Steamship lines, missionary societies, for example, spice trade. We have been selling things to each other for eons. These are representations, a beautiful series of maps from 1927 of trade made in Germany, of trade in wool, for example, in coffee, in corn. So these kinds of global trade networks have been going on for many, many years. It's not something that is new in 1980. Globalization is not new. What is new, it's that it's faster. So instead of the telegraph or the steamship, you have the internet. It's wider. It includes increasingly more and more and more larger parts of the planet. It is deeper in the sense that more and more aspects of life are dependent on it and are shaped by it. It's very hard to get away from it. It is more interactive. That is, that you have a whole variety of globalizations that are occurring simultaneously. You have a financial globalization, you have migration globalization, you have military globalization, you have economic globalization, and all of these are interacting constantly. Okay? For example, if you look at the relationship between air traffic, phone calls, remittances, and Turkish exports between Germany and Turkey, you see all those integrating. The Turkish population in Germany requires some products. They fly back to Turkey, which creates all sorts of opportunities for airlines. They make phone calls, which creates all sorts of new lines, which then facilitates the sending of more migrants, of more money, of more products, and on and on and on and on. It has more levels, okay? It involves all sorts of interactions in the population. It has simply more people, more money, more stuff than it ever has before. But is it new? No. Okay, so one of the lessons is let's calm down a little bit and stop going, oh my God, what is this thing? We can look at it and say, it's happened before. We've had global empires before. We have had these kind of communications before. We have had some of these challenges before. Let's use that. Let's use those structures. Let's use those experiences to make better sense of what we have. But also, on the other hand, to appreciate that because the system is deeper, wider, faster, has many more levels, the possibilities of interaction, particularly disastrous interaction, have increased. And we better be aware, again, of what that system looks like and what its limitations and what its dangers may be. So what about contemporary globalization? Here's a little representation. We had fun with this. The fries that bind us and the magic bean shop. You can see a couple of things here. This is why a map tells a lot of stories. First of all, you see, boy, there's a lot of McDonald's and there's a lot of Starbucks. All right? But notice the distribution. Anybody notice a north-south split here? Okay? How much of globalization is compacted in particular areas? Not everyone is globalizing quite the same way. Moreover, talking about the inside country and between country, also note that even as globalization is expanding across the globe, it doesn't expand equally to all sectors of society. So if you are in an upper middle class neighborhood in just about any part of the world, you are part of globalization. If you're in Buenos Aires, if you're in Johannesburg, if you're in Sydney, if you're in Bangkok, if you're in New York, you're all part of this globalized network. If you happen to be poor in the northeast of Brazil, in Appalachia, in one of the old native homelands in South Africa, then you're not. So in some ways, we have to remember that this geography, this between-country geography I'm giving you, may be hiding a lot of stories inside. But let's just take a quick peek at some of the characteristics of contemporary globalization. So we know, well, what has it brought about? It's brought about a massive technological revolution. And there's a cause and effect, chicken and egg problem here. How much does globalization cause us? How much does this permit globalization? But just three indicators: TV ownership going up, airline passengers, and of course the curve would continue on. This is a slightly old data. Internet users going up. So part of globalization has been this boom in technology. Actually, here's another historical lesson. It's always been so. You can link every single previous stage of globalization to some kind of technological fix or technological boom. What else is associated with it? Trade. This is just an index of trade as a percentage of GDP across the world, and massive increase from 1970. Almost a linear progression. Increasing trade has become more and more important. Trade as opposed to making stuff. We're now exchanging stuff internationally almost as much as we make it. Nothing is staying home, if you will. The global wealth. But be careful with this. Thomas Friedman is right. It's made a lot of people rich, but not everybody. Just to give you an indication, this blue line here is the OECD, the Rich Country Club. All right? From 1960 to 2000, per capita income has practically tripled. So those countries have benefited immensely. This is in constant dollars, obviously. Okay? Massive. The East Asian countries have benefited. But by the way, it's a slightly different y-axis because the absolute numbers are still not as high. But you can see that they have also increased. So both the OECD and the Asian Pacific coast have increased remarkably their wealth. The rest of the world, pretty flat. So globalization has meant, now we're beginning to go, this is getting kind of interesting. A lot of people have gotten very wealthy, and some have not changed their position at all. It has increased global inequality, and there's lots of measures that show that the distance between the rich countries and the poor countries has increased dramatically. There are methodological issues I won't bore you with. But the distance between, let us say, not even a place that has been visited by every single biblical plague like Sierra Leone or Liberia. The distance between Paraguay and the United States has increased exponentially in the last 30 years. And the distance between the rich and the poor inside every single country has also increased. So globalization has been accompanied by this unequal fate, if you will, or unequal set of lives. On the more positive side, it's been accompanied by a great deal of democratization. If we do, social scientists make all sorts of indices, et cetera, so we created something even worse, a poly index. All that means is we put a lot of indicators of democracy together. And that clearly shows from 1970 the number of generals, the number of tanks, if you will, that on the streets have gone down, the number of elections have gone up. So it's increased that. But what it's really increased, what it's really transformed is trade. And I want to give you a little bit of an idea of how that trade has been transformed, so we can go from this image of it's good or it's bad to a slightly more textured image about what is going on inside this beast, this phenomenon. Remember, the object of this is to try to locate what exactly is going on inside that organism. So let's look at trade. By the way, where you're going to use dollars, you can use lots of units. One of the most interesting works that are going on at the engineering school is translating all this commodity trade into virtual water. That is, how much water does it take to transform things? Anybody knows how much water it takes to make a gallon of milk? 10. If you count what the grass needs, what the cow eats, what you need to wash the truck that the cow's taking on, blah, 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 blah. So you can actually think of globalization as this massive exchange of water with some very interesting dynamics involved there. And the preservation, by the way, of notice the areas that have a lot of water and where they're going. And very bad news for China. But what we're going to do is we're going to just look in dollars. It's the simplest way. And again, this is what's happened to trade. This is in constant dollars. So this is a real increase. This isn't just inflation. This is 1948. From 1948 to 1963, relatively flat. Beginning in the 60s, in the 80s, you see that the slope increases rather significantly. And following 1989, it just goes straight up. So there has been a massive increase in trade. And start thinking about what that means. What that means in terms of extraction of materials, what that means in construction of infrastructure, what that means in just the strain that this is putting on not just an environment, but also a man-made environment. If you want to see the growth of trade, okay, this blue line here is how much it increases every year, trade. So notice that almost in no years has it gone below zero. Almost every single year, trade has gone up. This is global GDP. That's how much stuff we make. This is how much stuff we're trading, how much is increasing. So we're trading stuff a lot faster than we're making it. Okay? I want you to think about that. And what that involves, okay? What that tells you about the system. We're not necessarily producing anymore. We're just circulating it around a lot faster. Okay? And what does that necessarily imply? You can see the kinds of commodities that have increased, and I just want to compare two. This is oils, fuels, and minerals. So those basic commodities, there has not been a significant increase in the amount of trade in those. All right? But look at clothing. So some industries have been completely globalized. When was the last time you wore something made in the United States? Okay? So globalization has occurred unevenly in some ways, in that some industries have been heavily globalized, some have really been transformed, others have not. There's a lot of talk about goods versus services. We're still largely talking about stuff. This is the ratio of goods to services, and it's about 4-to-1. We're still trading more stuff than we are services. Globalization is very much about loading it on a shipping container, loading it on a plane, loading it on a truck, and moving some stuff. All right? Which, by the way, think about what it does in terms of commodities that we are using. Now, this is where it starts getting interesting. Who trades with whom? Boy, globalization, according to Thomas Friedman, has completely changed the planet. Depends which glasses you're wearing. Let me suggest one particular pair of glasses. This, what I've done here, is the share of world trade accounted for by different groups of countries. This red line is the percentage of world trade that's accounted for by the rich, with the rich. 75% of world trade basically occurs between about 25 countries. Okay? This blue line here is the percentage of world trade that's accounted for by the poor, the vast majority of the human population. Notice that the two curves have barely moved. So in 36 years, since 1970, globalization, it's increased, it's gotten faster, there's a lot more stuff, but the people who are involved haven't really shifted. So let's take this revolution talk and tone it down, with one prominent exception. Anybody know who this is? This is China, and of course it's on a different y-axis. But China has gone from less than 1% of world trade in 1970. By 2000, this is only 2003. By 2006, it's getting close to 10%. So China, and China alone, has been a revolutionary actor in this. But for the rest of the world, it has not really been transformed that much. Here, this is getting a little bit bizarre, but just to give you an idea. This is the total of world trade, okay? Like you saw, it's a linear growth. It just zooms more and more stuff. Now, where it gets interesting is these little bars here are the percentage of world trade that is accounted for by the big traders. And what you'll see is, yes, trade is increasing, but the relative share, not absolute, the relative share of those who do most of the trading has gone from about 12% to nearly a third. So the big are getting bigger, and the small are getting left by the side. Billie Holiday was right after all. And one indication of this is what happens with Africa. This is percentage of world trade in 1980 and 2001. Intra-African trade, trade inside the continent between Egypt and South Africa, between Nigeria and Kenya, today represents 0.13% of world trade. So if the Africans stopped trading with other Africans, nobody would notice. There's 99.87% left. But where you really see it is African trade, including trade with the United States and Euro 12, which is where they do most of their trade. That's gone from 5.5% in 1980 to less than 2%. So the continent of Africa could disappear in one big wave tomorrow, and world trade would be reduced by 2%. Okay? Again, just to give you an idea of where it's happening and where it is not happening. Now, people trade in different ways. You'll see basically that some people sell and some people buy. What I've done here is we've taken all the trade in various regions. NAFTA, the rest of the Americas, the Euro 12, the original Euro, the rest of Europe, the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Asia Pacific. Forget the rest of it. When you see what happens to the price of oil, Middle East, North Africa used to export a lot, but then with the price of oil, as now it's going back up. But the key relationship here is this one and this one. We buy, they sell. Again, start thinking about the engineering of this. This is not a system of exchanges. This is a system of us buying a lot of stuff, and the world, or a part of the world, making it. And you see it even more clearly if we look at the change since 2001. Now, I know this starts getting a little bizarre. These are exporters here. NAFTA, Americas, Euro 12, Europe, CIS, these are importers. And the length of the column is how much their trade increased over the last 20 years. The world is not flat. Most of the world is flat, actually. There hasn't been an increase. But the action has been in three ways. NAFTA to NAFTA trade has increased. So the trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico has increased dramatically. Asia to Asia trade has increased. Okay? NAFTA to Asia trade, particularly coming here, has increased. And intra-European trade has increased. And the rest of the world is basically watching passively. Now, what we want to do is we want to take all those things that you just saw, all those kinds of activities, and we want to map them. And we want to map them using transactions. What I mean by transactions is an exchange between one part of the globe and another. And it can involve people, cities, countries, organizations, families exchanging people, or firms exchanging goods. It can be trade, capital transfers, treaties, travel, collaborations, communication. And we now then have to develop the tools with which to visualize it. So imagine billions upon billions of stars, like Carl Sagan used to say, of transactions. And what it looks like is this. We counted it at some point. I think we have like about 1 million of these things. And what this is a list of countries. It could be a list of cities, list of countries here. And those cells are how much each country trades with the other country in a particular commodity. In this case, these are minutes of phone calls, international phone calls. So we have literally thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. What do you do with it? Remember the map. You need to simplify it. So you simplify it using networks. And let me just give you 3 model networks. And you all know what a network is. You were all in the 8th grade. You all know what a network is. A network is a clique. Who knows whom? Who gets invited to whom? Here are 3 simple models. The universal network. Everybody participates. Thomas Friedman's network of globalization. Everybody goes to everybody's parties. Everybody loves each other. We all sell each other Cokes, and it's just wonderful. The clustered. You can be paranoid about this, Samuel Huntington, and think this is the Christians, this is the Buddhists, the Confucius, this is Islam, and we just trade with each other. We don't trade with anybody else. Okay? Or you can be less paranoid about it and go, this is NAFTA. This is the Eurozone. This is ASEAN Plus. Or you can think of it as an empire. One person in the middle, with everybody trading with that one person or calling that person, and none of the others calling each other. What does the world look like? And the last thing I want to show you is a few images of what it looks like using these transactions and truly mapping globalization. There it is. That's world trade. The exam will be tomorrow. Let me tell you how to read this. This is a brilliant colleague of mine, John Galway, from Australia, invented this. And you take all those transactions, all those matrices, and you get this. And what this is all the countries of the world are ringed around this donut. And you can categorize them by any means you will, by religion, by language, by region, etc. Here they're categorized by region. And in this zone, as you will see, you map how much each one trades with ones and other categories. And here you map how much they trade within their own category. So this is trade inside Europe, and all of this here is the trade that Europe has with the rest of the world. Now, it's a little bit hard to visualize when you got it like this, but let me give you a better. This is world trade in 2001. It's a map representation. What we've done is we eliminated all the noise, and we created a threshold. Only give me trade past a certain point. So we don't want to know about the $25 that Panama sold to Niger. Okay? We want to know up to a certain amount. Okay? And we can talk about how we set those thresholds, etc. And basically what you see is, first of all, notice that a lot of countries are missing. Most of the world is irrelevant for world trade. It involves only these. And what does it look like? You've got Canada and the United States here, trading with each other, and serving as the center. Notice everybody trades with the United States. Sometimes they trade with each other, but the global trade system, if you think about it, is an open-ended angle, with NAFTA, basically the United States, at the vortex. At the very center of all of these flows, there we are. Globalization in this way looks very much like a representation of a hegemonic structure, of a single player having all of the marbles, if you will. Let me show you a different version of it. This, you can actually see a bigger version of this outside in the hallway in the sciences art. We did this very simply. We divided world trade into quartiles. Top quartile, that is all the links between countries that make up 25% of the total, then 50% of the total, then 75% of the total, then 100% of the total. This is 100%, like you saw before. Everybody trading. Thomas Friedman is so happy. This is 25%. 1/4 of the world trade is basically the U.S. with Japan and the U.S. with the euro. We could even move to 50%, and notice how concentrated it remains, and that there's relatively little trade between Europe and Asia. The United States remains the center. Let me give you another indication. This is 1980. We did this for 50%. It says 50%. I'm sorry. This is for a threshold, a particular threshold I can't remember right now. We kept the same threshold, relatively speaking, from 1980 to 2001. So in 1980, world trade, again, you see the pattern of the U.S. in the center. Remember, these are maps. These are abridgments. Okay? Notice what happens in 2001. Gets even simpler. Okay? No, we're not an empire. We can also break these down into regions. This is one of my favorites. This is the Americas in 1980. Anybody guess which country this is? Notice all roads lead to Miami, okay? There's a little bit of trade between Mexico and Canada, but everything is the United States. 21 years later, same picture. You can break it up, and what's interesting is this pattern gets repeated. This is Africa, including the United States and Euro 12. So what you see is this very strong link between the Euro 12 and the United States. But notice the rest of the African countries trading with the Euro 12. And of course, if you break it down further, trading within their empires. So Francophone Western Africa trades with France, etc. All right? And if you look, same thing. What's interesting here, by the way, you can't really see it in this, well, you can a little bit. Here's South Africa, which is relatively isolated in 1980. By 2001, South Africa has become a regional center. And it itself becomes, in a sense, a mini center of these trade exchanges. The Middle East, North Africa, what's really interesting here is the decline of Saudi Arabia. In 1980, Saudi Arabia is the center of all. By 2001, hello Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. Asia, you see that the relative decline of Japan. Now this is in 2001. This is the latest data we have uploaded. So 2005, these effects are going to be even bigger. You see the centrality of Japan here in Asia. By 2001, you get a much more complex network with China clearly rising. So you begin to see a different kind of structure, a different kind of physiology behind these forms of globalization. Europe gets more and more integrated. This is Germany right here. Again, it remains central, but what you find is many more links. Many more, the density, the relative density of the European network is increasing. You can also do it for fuels. I'm sorry, it's not reproduced very well. What it shows you, for example, is that fuels, petroleum, in some ways it's a fungible product. Oil is oil is oil. But that the world oil network is actually extremely regionalized. The United States gets its oil from Venezuela, Mexico, and Canada, and to a certain extent from from West Africa. Europe gets its oil and its gas from North Africa, from the North Sea, and from the former Soviet Union. And Asia gets its oil from the Middle East. So if you actually took a satellite picture of the Gulf of the Straits of Hormuz, okay, with the tankers, very few of the tankers are making right turns. They're making left turns. Start thinking about this as a system and what the fragilities are in that system. and where the dependencies are in that system and how things flow inside that system. There's, of course, other forms of globalization. Let me just show you very, very quickly. This is a map of phone calls in 1995. Getting data after 1995 is a problem because of the pesky little things that you all have in your pockets. But just to give you an illustration of how the world works. Same principle. Okay, this is inside category, this is between categories, except these are organized by income. These are the rich. These are the ex-socialist economies. These three are the three levels of poor. The rich call each other a lot. They're the in-group. Hi, Betty, you want to come to the party? Oh, sure, okay, well, let's go. Okay? And everybody else is trying to call the rich. But they're not calling each other. This is an American high school, if you will. All right? These crowds are not trying to be with each other. All they want to be is with the in crowd, and the in crowd is very tightly defined. Another illustration, world air traffic. This is very cool because you can get it on a city-by-city basis. And we measure passengers. This is in 2002. Notice the centrality of London. This is the entire world. London is the world hub. You break down Heathrow, you break down the world hub. And even if you go up to 50% of world air traffic, notice again the centrality of London. So you can see which places are critical, and you can, again, break this down by region, etc. Air traffic Europe, obviously, London again. Notice the centrality, and Paris coming in a distant second. This is another favorite line. This is air freight, actually, and this is the Americas. Guess where this is? Miami. All right? The rest of the countries in Latin America barely can fly to each other. And this is still true. If you're in Sao Paulo and you wish to go to Santiago, it will often be easier to go to Miami and then to fly back to Santiago. All right? And you can see why. Because the networks are all set up to go to one center and then from that center back out. Now, think about this in terms of fragility. Think about this in terms of infrastructure. Think about this in terms of power. Who gets to be that central node? Who gets to be the one that sells you useless bottles of perfume or liquor or $8 hamburgers and $6 coffees, if you want to think of it at the micro level? It is those concessions at the airport. Do you want a concession at the Sao Paulo airport or at the Miami airport? Give me Miami airport. I want the borders at Miami airport. Okay, 300 million copies of the Da Vinci Code sold, you know? Okay? You can also see it with tourism. So you can see particular patterns of tourism. Mexico, USA, Canada, USA, an internal European one, and a big one actually going from Hong Kong and China. World migration, you can also do it with world migration. And of course, here again, we are the center of the world migratory network. And again, we're playing with these in all sorts of representations. The point is to get those maps. So, what does all of this mean? We end up with that man with the beard. Now, he wrote this in, I believe it's in 1846. And if you read this for a second, it's amazing what that old German man knew. And I've replaced bourgeoisie with globalization. Globalization has given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption. And Marx, especially this from the Communist Manifesto, should be read out loud. So, has given a cosmopolitan character to production and to consumption in every country. It has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. By industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed, not at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations have common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. Well, he was wrong. And from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. It, globalization, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, to become globalized themselves. In one world, it creates a world after its own image. So what globalization, we better be aware of it, because it is creating a world very, very much in its own image. Whether that world is good or whether that world is bad, whether that world is healthy, whether that world is sick, it is happening. So the important thing is not to have these arguments about, again, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but to realize that whichever way it is, we are becoming it. And again, if you wish to look at more of these in detail, go to one of these and have fun with it. Thank you very much. I understand that there's a little bit of time for, I'm not sure, is there time for, should I take some questions? Or yeah. So, I know, you're flabbergasted. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is much a question or a comment.
Yeah.
By profession, I'm a supply chain management professional working in IT consulting. What I do didn't exist even when I was in college. And if I look at what you put up there, part of what I think is happening is you have a very educated domain, the U.S., for example, pursuing the exploiting of the new technology, things like ERP systems and telecommunications, the internet, as hard as they can.
Right.
There is a furious amount of energy and effort to exploit those technologies, and it's showing up in very integrated supply chains, which are driving the hegemonic node, if you will, in the model. There's a lot of people who don't even know what I do exists,
Right.
unless the fact that it's driving this forward. And, you know, I appreciate what you put forward. And to me, it crystallizes a lot of thoughts, but I think there are some qualitative things behind it that are driving.
Absolutely. Please don't take away from this idea, sort of bad 1960s. There's some guy in the Rockefeller Center going, hey, globalization. No, in fact, that's the whole message of the Marx quote. I put him up there partly because what he's saying is this system drives itself. If you wish to compete, you are going to have to create a global assembly line. If you're going to sell, you're going to have to create these very complex systems of supply. It's not that there's anybody behind it. The system itself is requiring it. And it's reflective. My favorite example of this, we were in Korea, not this past summer, but the previous summer. And the Koreans were going crazy because FedEx had decided, I think it was FedEx or DHL, I'm not sure, had decided to move their Northeast Asia center from Incheon in Seoul to Harbin in Manchuria. And the Koreans were very, very well aware that by moving the centrality of this network, they were moving, in a sense, they were shifting the light away from Incheon and Seoul towards China. So you have a system that is forcing everybody to do this. And people are aware, and so they're competing, and it just gets faster and faster. My biggest point is, at which point does it become uncontrollable? And I'm not necessarily a fan of Michael Crichton, but you can imagine almost sort of a Michael Crichton type scenario where the complications get such that the system simply cannot feed on itself, that it has so many cogs. And there's also the environmental concern. And that's what motivates a lot of this, is how complex a system are we creating that we depend on it for our daily bread, and should one little piece break down, should you have a chaotic effect, as in the butterfly wings fluttering in Brazil, you get no sugar available in the United States. That's precisely your is what that's at the core of this, what I'm interested in, how fragile the whole thing may be. Yes, sir.
Has there been any definition of effort on the lower level? For instance, what does poor mean? For instance, do we have what decision analysis people call an objective function? What would be a good thing? Is empire by itself bad? You didn't say so,
No.
but the implication was
Oh, no, please. And I don't mean to make that implication. That's just my old, Marxist graduate student coming through or whatever, channeling. No. Yeah.
Last but not
Yeah.
least, that wonderful German man,
Yeah.
how much he knew, but it's amazing how much he did not
Oh,
know.
absolutely. Oh, no. If there was a fan of capitalism, it was Marx. I mean, he says this with a great deal of enthusiasm, and he sees it, then he gets the rest of it wrong. But I think what we need to do, if we're going to talk about what system might work, we need to have philosophers that are going to tell us what to maximize. I can't do that. I'm not a philosopher or a religious leader. And then we need a technology that allows us to do the calculation to show us whether we're getting close to that maximization point. I can see many arguments for an empire in terms of some global utility. But I can see that, never forgetting that I happen to be a citizen of the empire. Should I not be a citizen of the empire, the benefits that accrue from that empire might look very different. And this idea of the good or the bad, I want to get away from it, because what we need to do is to just quantify this and go, look, what this means is these guys are getting this and these guys are getting this. Do we wish to live with that world or do we not wish to live with that world? That's the next level question. But at least to understand what that system looks like. One thing that's very, very clear, by the way, which is this work, the last 5 years has shown me, I'm very much against the anti-globalization folks, except on environmental grounds. On environmental grounds, it's irrefutable. What we're doing to the planet is, and globalization is feeding it. On social justice grounds, it is wrong. There's very, very clear evidence that the major part of the poverty in the world does not come from globalization. It comes from not being globalized and not being part of the global network. In that way, Thomas Friedman is right. Now, there are costs associated with being part of the network, and there's injustices. But to simply say it's not good for these people, that's wrong. All the evidence indicates that if it's bad to be globalized, it's even worse not to be. That's no exit at all. Yes, sir.
Mike, one way to be, and this comes off the top of my head, I was to look at it in philosophical background is to look at the eugenics, the energetics of it, and see, because the environmental costs are truly sort of bad in many respects. And having, in a former life, done some things that involve criminal justice, and I saw that you do need to have certain jobs available for certain folks and populace to be able to make a sort of living wage. And you could argue they don't go away, but I think that's sort of a false argument. A lot of those things do go away. So there is a certain societal decision that I'm willing to pay an extra $5 for a pair of shoes because somebody in Boston is going to have, a job. And maybe I'm paying a little bit more for my local organically grown produce because it's not shipped from Chile or somewhere like that. So I think those sorts of, if you look at the energy input of it, is another way to sort of maybe map things and think of them. Is it worth the cost?
Right. People are doing
They talk about the food and ethics. They talk about a lot of that too, because one of the issues is it is nice for someone. You think about somebody in Costa Rica to be able to make a living wage growing like organic chocolate that they sell to us. I mean, there's
Oh, no.
nothing wrong with that.
The question becomes, what is the cost of shipping that chocolate, et cetera, in terms of the environment? The real nightmare scenario, and this brings in the inside globalization, and I believe I'm supposed to let all you guys out at 9, so this will be the last thing I'll say. The nightmare scenario is where you get this between country globalization and within country globalization looking a little bit like Latin America, where you get maybe 10 to 15% of the population of the globe partaking of this incredible richness. I mean, we have more consumer goods than any English aristocrat could dream of, even in the 20s or in the Edwardian era. You have 10 or 15% of the planet that's integrated and living with each other, and increasingly you have 80% of the planet that, as far as the global economy is concerned, is completely irrelevant. We don't need them as laborers because machinery. We don't need them as producers, and worse, we don't even need them as consumers. And that's where you get the truly nightmarish scenarios, where you get these islands, in a sense, of interconnected globalizations, even whole countries, let's say, in the case of the OECD, and then the rest of the world is this sort of hinterland to which no one goes to and which no one pays attention to. And unfortunately, for most of my work is in Latin America, that is a very, very possible model of globalization. And that one scares the bejesus out of me, because you will then have all the benefits. You will reduce the environmental cost, because after all, it only involves 10 to 15% of the population, and the other 80% can go to hell. And that's a scary model. And I'm just kidding. Am I supposed to stop at 9? Or is that okay? Okay. Well, let me just give another person a chance. Yes, sir.
We're talking about instability. Does the Great Depression connect in any way to that?
In that, I mean, and Harold James, my colleague Harold James in the history department, has written a beautiful book about the Great Depression. It's essentially a proto-globalized system that existed prior to 1929, and the links in it start breaking down. And that the system had become so dependent on being able to coexist and exchange these systems, that when the means of that exchange, when the instruments of that exchange broke down, then the whole thing collapsed. And people talk about that we have much better regulations now, a much more vigorous regulatory environment that existed certainly in 1929, 1930, 1931. But I want to argue that we have a much more complex system than we have. I mean, the perfect example of this is what's going on with hedge funds. If you see some of the data on financial flows, it is petrifying, because you realize that one computer glitch in the wrong place, and being able to go back and figure out where the books, whose books are whose, is going to be so, and again, nothing is lost. It's not like a bomb has exploded. You simply are missing 5 seconds. Imagine 5 seconds of global financial data goes missing. 5 seconds. Oops. Then, very much as in 1929, do the means, the instruments by which this system is kept together start going asunder. And since we've lost large parts of our autonomy and our autarky, then we can't quite go back. We're too used to buying raspberries from Sinaloa instead of raspberries from Cherry Hill. We're not going to be able to just grow raspberries in Cherry Hill. Give me one last example of this. Sorry, I get really excited about this. In Argentina decided that it was no longer going to manufacture insulin back in the 1990s. Why? Because other countries could manufacture insulin much more effectively. Economies of scale, classic good economics. Why are you going to manufacture insulin for a market of only about 36 million people? Only a small percentage of which can afford that kind of medical care. It's not worth it. You simply import it from other big producers, Brazil or the United States, et cetera. Great. Works beautifully. Price of insulin actually went down. Except in 2001, 2002, when Argentina runs out of dollars. And it literally cannot buy insulin. It no longer has the production to make it itself, and it doesn't have the capacity to buy it in that global marketplace. Not because it doesn't have any stuff, but it doesn't have those particular green papers called dollars. And so for a while there was an insulin shortage in Buenos Aires. That's a very small example of the kind of feedback loops that one thing can lead to another, and all of a sudden we no longer have X, which means we no longer have Y, which means we no longer have Z, and we really need Z to survive. And I'm sorry, my children need to go to sleep, so I better put them to bed or they're going to be extremely grouchy. Thank you very much.